Ladies and gentlemen, dear students, lend me your ears. I'm just going to do a short presentation of our dear guest, Marit Koskinen. I'm going to do that both in English, because the full lecture is going to be in English, and just a shortened version in Serbian in case that you miss something. Marit Koskinen is Professor Emeritus in Film Studies at Stockholm University. She was the first scholar to be given access to Ingmar Bergman's private papers during the last years of his life, which eventually led to the formation of the Ingmar Bergman Foundation Archive. Publications in English include Ingmar Bergman Revisited, Cinema and Performance and the Arts, and The Silence, Pictures in the Typewriter, Writings on the Screen. Aside from research and teaching, Marit Koskinen was for a long time film critic at Dagens Nyheter, basically Swedish largest daily. She has also served as a member of the Swedish Broadcasting Commission, and between 2011 and 2016 as member of the board of the Swedish Film Institute. Presently, she is the chair of the Swedish Film Academy. Marit Koskinen je profesor emeritus filmskih studija na Stockholmskom univerzitetu. Ona je prvi fakultetski ili akademski poslanik koji je dobio pristup privatnoj arhivi Ingmara Bergmana, što je u perspektivi dovelo posthumno do stvaranja Ingmar Bergman Foundation Archive. Njene knjige na engleskom obuhvataju naslove kao što su Ingmar Bergman Revisited, film performance i umetnosti, i Ingmar Bergman Tišina, slike u pisaćoj mašini, pisanje na ekranu. Pored bavljenja istraživačkim radom i profesurom, Marit Koskinen je dugo vremena bila filmski kritičar za najveće švedske dnevne novine. Također je bila član komiteta švedske, kako mi to kaže, broadcasting, difuzne agencije. A u periodu između 2011. i 2016. godine bila je član borda Švedskog filmskog instituta, dok je danas na vrlo prestižnoj poziciji predsjedavajućeg Švedskom filmskom akademijom. Zamolila bih vas da jednim platnim aplauzom
Well, thank you for this magnificent, can't believe I did all that. Very nice to hear. Now, I know that you have some little leaflets here that you can pick up afterwards. A very simple thing if you're interested on Ingmar Bergman, sort of the essence, if you will, that I try to pick out. But I'll refer to what I say in the first page there to begin with, that come to think of it, now in 2018, it's almost 20 years ago, that Bergman asked me to take a look at what he called his hell of a mess in his private library at his then residence at Fårö, that small island in the Baltic Ocean, where he shot many of his films from the 1960s on, and where he lived until he died at age 89 in 2007. Now, this question, I understood later, was of course highly sort of planned or premeditated on Bergman's part, because by that time he had, 9 kids, had been married a number of times, and of course knew, because he was not stupid, he was a businessman as well, besides being everything else. He knew that any legacy he had, his archives, his papers, his manuscripts, would most likely be sold to the highest paid individual, highest paying individual or institution in the world who were, happened to be interested in his stuff. And so he then, I understood, contacted someone in the university that could probably, help him create something that would sort of secure his legacy instead of being sold off. And this year, of course, 2018, as you know, is a commemoration of his birth year, 1918. And there are festivities undertaken, I don't know, all around the world. That is something I come from a small country called Sweden, right? About still 9 million inhabitants, possibly. And when you have well-known artist and celebrity, I dare say, like Bergman, you realize that you are regarded in a certain way if you say that you're dealt with Bergman or you're from Sweden. A Swedish film critic once said, if it rains on Bergman, it sprinkles on Sweden somehow. And that, I think, we became very aware of in 2007 when Bergman died. I'll get back to that in a bit. But my point is that I hope some of you have seen something by Bergman, and if you've seen all of his stuff, if you're a nerd like me and have sort of drenched yourself in Bergmania, you realize that you're not dealing with sort of only a national monument that you're supposed to revere or, you know, go down on your knees to, but I would claim a living artist who is, in fact, at present performed, just to give you a little fact here, the most performed in productions playwright in all of Scandinavia, if not Northern Europe. I mean, all of his plays are now being issued, published and all that. And not only that, his films are being produced on stage. There has always been an interesting relationship between Bergman's films and his work in the theater. He staged about 150 plays. And of course, I think that in a way one could say that those productions in the theater very much became the universe, or university and the universe for that matter, for Bergman as a filmmaker. In other words, he learned how to create characters, he took out themes, he learned his history lesson in the theater, because back then there was no school such as yours that can teach you those things. He had to learn on the factory floor, so to speak. And I think the theater played a very intricate part in Bergman's development, and which can also be read clearly in the way he constructs his scripts and characters, and from his films on the whole. And in academia, if you look at sort of the more theory where I come from, I haven't held a camera in my life, you should know that. There is also a big interest rather this year in Bergman, or not only this year, actually now is being published more books than ever in the last few years on Bergman and music, Bergman and philosophy, Bergman and the welfare state, Swedish style, Bergman and psychology, language, feminism, you name it. It's, you know, you can find it all there. So there must be something in his, let's say, 50 films that really still pulls people and interests them, even if the films are black and white and all that. Now, perhaps you haven't seen too many of those films, but I just want to remind you of a few of them that are said to belong to the classics. You may have heard, of course, perhaps you younger, Fanny and Alexander, you might have seen from the 80s. How can people watch a film about a medieval knight who talks with allegorical death on a beach and discusses the be or not to be with death himself? Anyway, it's an allegorical story, but the interesting thing is the splash it made, for instance, not least in the States. Then came the auteur theory, via the French, of course, the idea of the filmmaker as an artist, writer, creator, and director, all in one. And that, of course, fit the American university idea, because close reading was in at the time, and there came suddenly somebody who made films that sort of were right in there to be interpreted, deciphered, as questions around. So there are also contextual reasons, I think, that why Bergman became as big as it did. He was right there at the right time in various contexts, both in Sweden, for the French, I'll get back to that quite soon, and the States, and then beyond. I can just tell you that just the other day I had to say no thank you to come to Shanghai to talk about Bergman. I had to thank no to a couple of places in India, not to speak of certain countries in Europe, and hold on to your hats, Uganda. They wanted to have a thing on Bergman as well. So yes, things happened this year, 2018, and maybe it's a good chance for everyone who was a little bit interested and haven't really seen anything or wondered what it's all about to sort of at least partake in some of the films that are being screened here in Belgrade. Well, there are the films then, The Naked Night, called Sawdust and Tinsel, for instance, Seven Seal, as I said, Wild Strawberries the year after, The Silence, Persona, Cries and Whispers, and of course Scenes from a Marriage, which I think, besides Seven Seal, is the film that perhaps most people have seen, or at least heard about. In any case, so no wonder then, I'll usher into this, that when he died then at the age of 89 in 2007, the obituaries, death, on his death in the papers, in the international press were full of tributes, and he was pronounced among the foremost of film auteurs. I think at that time it really became clear Ingmar Bergman had become sort of Bergman, somewhat like Garbo or Picasso. He was now sort of elevated to almost a brand name, or at least a concept that you didn't have to give a sort of a first name to. But then again, when it comes to Bergman, who was active for 60 decades, from the 40s up till 2003, there were also the negative voices, the skeptical ones, for good reason sometimes, because after all, Bergman had already, at certain times when he died, been pronounced dead several times, well before he was dead. Some had thought him dead quite literally, perhaps simply because he had been around for so long. And as I said, it's no wonder, given all of his work that he did. From Frenzy, his first script in 1944, that actually won the Grand Prix in Cannes, directed by another director, Alf Sjöberg, but he wrote the script for it based on his school time in high school, and it became somewhat of a debate around that film already, because he portrayed school as a kind of fascist institution at the time in 1944. Anyway, from there on, 1944, to his last film, Sarabande, which was actually made for television in 2003 that he made at the age of 85. And that's the one film that I understand that is sort of begins the series of films shown here in Bergland. I think it's a bit strange because it is, and we can get back to that later, sort of an old late work, as it's sometimes called, when a director sort of rehashes, goes back to, revisits, reinterprets his previous work. But it may be interesting to start from the back and then sort of work backwards into his earlier films. That's an idea too. Anyway, others, critics as well as academics, when Bergman died, had proclaimed Bergman metaphorically dead, even if they knew he was still around, in the meaning of being culturally passé. As a writer, they could snort. He's not much about the sort of three-penny philosopher that they wrote, idolizes in one's teens, but eventually grow out of. And as for cinematic style, somebody said, Bergman is at best a skillful craftsman representing only a stage in film history. Somebody called him a modernist who is no longer new. Now, an interesting aspect of Bergman's fall from grace, previously having been so adulated, that can be illustrated by some aging critics who sometimes feel the urge to revisit the sins of their youth, some of them being Bergman's films. Now, one example can be found in an article called Whatever Happened to Ingmar Bergman, which was written around the centennial of cinema in 1995. And the author of the article goes here back to 3 black and white, very sort of stark, serious films Bergman called them his trilogy about the silence of God from the early 1960s. And the writer of the article says, I resaw the trilogy again recently, I quote him now, Through a Glass Darkly from 61, Winter Light, 63, and The Silence from 63 as well. And, he writes, the experience was so powerful that I feel moved to urge that we reincorporate this man into the living flux of film culture. Why, he asked himself? Well, because Bergman's trilogy, and I quote, was a shudder in the culture that would go on to create a whole cinema of visionary anti-narrative. Everything from Andrei Tarkovsky's The Sacrifice to Mike Lee's Naked, and the bleakest tragic-comic yarns of Kieslowski and Lars von Trier. So, in other words, after first having said, Bergman is the past, he's a dinosaur. Actually, Bergman called himself, in the book of memoirs on his film, he called himself, I'm probably a dinosaur, but here are my memories anyway. Still having come to that conclusion that Bergman was passé, getting back to the films made this old critic change his mind, and that I find is interesting. It's the way things recirculate, not only for the creator, him or herself, but also for us as audiences. I'm sure you know too that if you see a film that you loved perhaps a few years ago, go back to it, you say, what the heck did I see in that film? What happened? Well, you happened. So I mean, something, you develop. The film strip, or whatever it is these days, is still the sort of information on it is exactly the same, but something happened. And if things happen with individuals, things happen with societies, things are received differently. Things are perceived differently. In any case, now let's get to the issue of today, I thought. Now I chose, as you've heard from the title of this talk, sort of a gender, men, women, and everything in between, so to speak. Even if I'm not at all a gender scholar. But I think that if you watched a few Bergman films, you realize that it's impossible almost not to get somehow into those issues dealing with human relationships. Because a lot of his work is about human identity. And if there's anything he's concerned with is human identity. So what I thought was to see if I can get this started soon again. The French and how they perceived Bergman's women in the early 50s, and then I show 4 film clips just to refresh your minds or memories, or maybe you haven't seen it at all, so even better than that I show the clips. Anyway, it's hardly news, I would say, that women take a prominent position then in Bergman's films, or that they have contributed to his fame around the world. Already in the 1950s, French critics commented on Bergman's Truffaut, Godard, and all those, they commented on his, and I quote, penetrating and unique understanding of the female psyche, they wrote. Some scholars, even French ones at the time, saw kind of a distinct women's period in Bergman's films at the time, early 1950s. So that they categorized, one can even say, his films at the time, from some kind of a gender criteria, before it was even called gender criteria. And then, when the films of the 1960s and 70s appeared, with grand roles written for people like, you probably won't know these names, Ingrid Thulin, Bibi Andersson, Liv Ullmann. Even, it had to be admitted, even by Bergman's harshest critics, that yes, Bergman did, to an unusual extent, allow female characters to somehow take on existential burdens, which perhaps other filmmakers would have chosen men in the lead characters to sort of carry. And considering this, his films then should be, let's say, should have been a kind of ideal for, let's say, a gender or feminist-oriented discourse, but at least Swedish writers at the time remained quite skeptical of Bergman's compared to the French ones. In an article called Ingmar Bergman in Women's Land, written by a Swedish woman, well, if you look at Bergman's film, they're usually full of stereotypes. And she saw basically three categories: the good bad girl, the motherly woman, and the demonic id, witch woman, you know, the Freudian concept of id, you know, that lives in the basement, basically, among all of us. Also, there was another Swedish critic, Marianne Höök, who went on to categorize Bergman's women, and she called them ideal types. She said that there are basically also three numbers. There was the triumphant Venus, the superior, strong, primordial woman with a positive outlook on life, often portrayed by the ample Eva Dahlbeck, which I'll show you quite shortly. And Bergman himself called this woman's type actually his battleship femininity, who sort of survived and conquered all. There was, secondly, the Diana type, this journalist wrote. That is the cool, she took, as you can hear, mythology to her help. Venus, and then she went to Diana type, the cool intellectual woman, the equal antagonist of the man. Finally, she wrote, there's the Hebe type, the goddess of youth, the young woman in the field of tension between sweetness and danger, innocence and animal. And she concluded, in actual fact, Ingmar Bergman, as a especially prominent women psychologist, is definitely something of an illusion, a cherished dream, perhaps most from the point of view of a starved female audience, she said. Now that's pretty cruel, I think, or at least you know, one-sided. And here I wanted to show you one of those early films with the battleship femininity, Eva Dahlbeck, in a dialogue with a man on a train, and you realize there's something going on there, but you're not quite sure why. And you can just listen to or rather look at, because it's subtitled in English, what goes on, what's being said here, and think about the fact that it's a film from 1953-54, and I think it's quite not fair to say that Bergman didn't give. Now let's see, which was